"What does your father do?" A question that seemed merely polite. But when Jasmine replied, "He drives a bus," the entire dinner table fell silent. Then the polite smiles began to change color. The Tremonts, an elite family. They ran a tech company worth hundreds of millions. They lived in a grand estate, sipped 15-year-aged wine, and they could not accept that their son, a young CEO, was going to marry a girl whose stepfather drove a city bus. A man like that. What could he possibly know about our world? They laughed. They scoffed. They assumed that man would never belong in the rooms where their family's destiny was decided. But they were wrong. 30 years behind the wheel. He didn't just drive his daughter to school. He was quietly steering the entire Tremont family toward the day they'd be forced to bow their heads. Stay with us until the end, to witness how one silent father made an entire dynasty lift their eyes and face their own pride. Warm amber light filled the Tremont mansion's dining room, spilling over a long banquet table draped in white silk. Silverware gleamed, crystal glasses sparkled under the high-hanging chandelier. Jasmine sat with perfect posture, maintaining a polite smile even as her hands clenched tightly beneath the table. This was her first time meeting Lucas's entire family. Her boyfriend, the young founder and CEO of Tremont Tech, a breakout star in the tech startup world. Across from her sat Carl Tremont, silver-haired in a tailored grey suit with an appraising stare sharp enough to belong in a boardroom. Beside him, his wife Eileen, stately, swan-necked, a strand of pearls wrapped around her throat like a quiet declaration of status. Lucas, visibly tense, tried to ease the atmosphere. He poured Jasmine a glass of wine and said with a gentle smile, "Jasmine studied economics at Wharton, then worked as a financial controller at 2 major firms. She's brilliant." Carl gave a faint nod. Eileen tilted her head slightly. "Oh? And what about your family, dear? What do your parents do?" Jasmine smiled, her voice steady. "My mother passed away when I was young. I was raised by my stepfather. He drives a public city bus." In that moment, it was as if someone had abruptly silenced the soft cello playing in the background. The air around the table thudded with the dry clack of Carl setting his knife down on his plate. Eileen blinked, forcing a tight smile. "Well, work is important, as long as there's good character." Lucas sipped his wine, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Jasmine could feel it. From Eileen's glance at her modest dress to Carl's faintly pursed lips, everything was shifting. They hadn't said anything overtly cruel, but Jasmine knew. They had already decided who she was, not by her education or her character, but by a single word: bus driver. The dinner ended earlier than usual. Jasmine felt the heaviness in the air pressing against her throat, but she remained polite as she said goodbye and was walked to her car by Lucas. He hugged her gently, whispering, "Don't let it get to you. You're amazing. You know that." She nodded, trying to smile, but inside something had quietly begun to crack. Inside the mansion, as the front door clicked shut, Carl Tremont set down his wine glass with a grimace. "What were you thinking, Lucas? A girl, raised by a bus driver?" Lucas turned back, his voice tense. "I love Jasmine. She's more capable than half the spoiled rich girls you used to introduce to me." Carl scoffed, letting his disdain show. "Capable or not, blood is blood, Lucas. She was raised among the working class. Do you really think she belongs at the executive table, with a man in a silver and blue bus uniform standing behind her?" Eileen interjected, her tone gentler but just as cutting. "Lucas, you're a Tremont. This family spent nearly 30 years building our name. If the world sees your wedding, and there's a stepfather in a worn-out suit standing beside you, what do you think the media will say?" Lucas fell silent. He didn't know how to respond because deep down, even he had once felt a flicker of shame when Jasmine spoke of her stepfather. Carl leaned forward, hands braced on the table, and delivered his final verdict. "If she doesn't have the courage to cut ties with that poor past of hers, then maybe you should reconsider." And in that moment, something took root in Lucas's mind, not because he agreed, but because he had no words to refute it. 2 years earlier, The Belmont Hotel downtown, the grand hall draped in cream silk, crystal chandeliers casting glittering light over hundreds of lavish evening gowns and tuxedos. It was the annual charity gala hosted by the university Jasmine once attended. She had been invited to speak as a distinguished alumna, a rising star in the finance world, and an inspiration to young professionals. She attended with her stepfather, Edward Carter, the man who had raised her since she was 6. He wore an old grey suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, eyes kind but slightly out of place amid the sea of polished elites. As Jasmine stepped onto the red carpet, cameras flashed. The MC greeted her warmly. "Welcome, Jasmine Carter, a rising star in finance. And who have you brought with you tonight?" She paused. In that fleeting instant, her eyes met Edward's, standing just behind her, holding her coat with a proud smile. And then, she turned to the host and offered a faint smile. "Just a family acquaintance." The cameras continued to flash. No one noticed the man standing quietly behind her. The man who had stayed up countless nights working extra shifts to gather the tuition she was too ashamed to mention to her friends. The man who held her hand the night she broke down over her first failed exam. The man who once told her, "You don't need a biological father, you already have a dad, if you're willing to call me that." In a quiet corner of the ballroom, Edward stood still. He smiled softly, then stepped back a few paces and quietly turned away. His tie was slightly crooked, but he didn't fix it. He walked out into the gentle rain and vanished behind the frosted glass doors. As if he had never been there at all, in the place where his daughter was finally shining. The small kitchen Jasmine shared with her stepfather barely spanned 15 square meters, but it was always warm, with the scent of coffee and leftover rice lingering in the air. The old fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered gently, while a rickety fan clattered softly in the twilight hour. Jasmine sat at the table, stirring a cup of cold tea she hadn't touched in 30 minutes. She didn't look up, but from the corner of her eye, she saw him at the sink, carefully slicing an apple and placing it into a lunchbox for his upcoming bus shift. He wore a white shirt, the shoulders slightly frayed, the cuffs neatly folded. Every movement was familiar, like the steady heartbeat of an old home. She had grown up in those arms. She used to sit in the passenger seat each afternoon he picked her up from school. She used to say, "One day I'll buy you a big car, even better than a bus." But somewhere along the way, she tried to get off that bus. She chose to walk toward glittering parties and polished rooms. And now she no longer dared to return. Edward turned around, placed the lunchbox on the table, and sat down across from her. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then he said softly, his voice barely above a breath, "I made extra fish, the kind you like. You might be hungry later." Jasmine looked into his eyes. For a long time, they were still warm, like they'd always been, still patient, still here, even after she had walked away. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling. "Dad, But the rest wouldn't come out. Instead, a single tear fell into the palm of her clenched hand. Edward smiled gently. "You don't have to explain anything. I understand." That sentence carried no blame, no resentment, only love, and the quiet forgiveness of a man once introduced as a family acquaintance. Lucas's penthouse overlooked the city, glittering with lights, but tonight nothing sparkled in Jasmine's eyes. She stood in the middle of the living room, hands trembling slightly, her eyes red and swollen. Lucas stood across the table from her, his face tight, his voice colder than ever. "You sat there in silence during that dinner, not a single word to defend me. My parents talked like my father was some burden." Lucas clenched his jaw. He had tried to stay calm, but the mix of anger and confusion finally broke loose. "And did you defend him, Jasmine? Or have you forgotten that you were ashamed of him too?" Jasmine froze. The air around her seemed to crystallize into stillness. Lucas stepped closer, his voice sharp. "That gala 2 years ago, what did you say when the MC asked who he was? A family acquaintance. That's what you said, right in front of him. You think I didn't know?" Jasmine stepped back, her heart pounding so loud it echoed in her chest. Lucas continued, "You're angry that my family looked down on him. But you were the one who disowned him, in front of 100 people. And now you want to play the righteous daughter, to lecture me." Silence. Jasmine had no reply, every defense caught in her throat. Her face went pale, and in her mind, the image of her father in that worn suit, standing quietly in the rain, flashed like a slow, stinging slap. You don't understand," she whispered. "No, Jasmine, you're the one who doesn't understand what you did." Lucas turned his back. She stood alone, in that luxurious apartment, the city lights outside blurred behind the glass. And for the first time, she no longer knew who she was anymore. 3 weeks after the argument, Jasmine hadn't spoken to Lucas since. Every day at work, she avoided the news, not wanting to see his name splashed across every headline. But the thing she most wanted to avoid was exactly what she couldn't escape. Tremont Tech had just officially lost its $80 million contract with Solaris Group. The company's stock nosedived. The media dubbed it the first stumble of a genius startup. Internally, the company fractured. Shareholders applied pressure. Employees grew anxious. Inside the Tremont estate, the atmosphere was no longer the same refined elegance as that dinner weeks ago. Carl slammed a stack of financial reports onto the table. "Are you playing games with this family's hundreds of millions, Lucas?" Across from him, Lucas sat with sunken eyes, fatigue etched deep into his face. "I did everything I could. Solaris changed the terms at the last minute." "Stop making excuses," Carl snapped, each word clipped and sharp. "What you call youthful drive is dragging this entire empire under." Eileen chimed in, her tone softer but no less cutting. "You need real advisors, elite partners, not a girlfriend who brings her stepfather as some symbol of morality." Lucas clenched his fists. Jasmine had never been the cause, but now every failing was being pinned to her name. Carl stood, walked toward the window and stared out at the back garden. "We need an investor, someone who can save this company, not another spoiled startup boy playing CEO in magazine interviews." What none of them knew was this: the person about to appear to save this company didn't need a spotlight, just an old suit, and a memory that had never been forgiven. Monday morning, the Tremont Tech boardroom. No smiles, no small talk. The only sounds were pages turning, and the ticking of the wall clock counting down like a warning. A young board member raised his hand. "There's an investment firm called Vantage Holdings. They've quietly acquired nearly 18% of our shares, all within the past week." Carl Tremont frowned. "Vantage who? I've never seen that name on any global top fund list." "They're a private equity firm, new but aggressive. They've just submitted an offer to buy out all remaining public shares at a 25% premium over market value." Eileen lifted her eyes from her phone. "Who's behind it?" Silence swept the room. The board member shook his head. "No one knows. All documents are filed under a legal entity, no individual names attached." Carl let out a scoffing laugh, the kind born from old money arrogance. Probably some nouveau riche land barons, sold off real estate, pooled their cash, and now think they can play tech tycoons. Lucas sat beside him, silent. But in his mind, a quiet alarm had begun to ring. Vantage Holdings, that name had never appeared in any major negotiation. But the speed of their takeover was terrifying. At the same time, elsewhere in the city, a discreet law office on the 27th floor. A middle-aged woman stepped in and handed an envelope to her assistant. On the envelope it read, "Vantage Holdings. Phase 2, initiate acquisition protocol. Ownership identity to remain undisclosed until the final moment." The assistant nodded. "Understood, Ms. Amanda. Everything is right on schedule." And in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, Edward Carter had just returned home from a late-night bus shift. He removed his coat, opened his aging laptop, and logged into a private account. The screen displayed the Vantage Holdings logo. Beneath it, a progress bar. Tremont Tech Holdings, 62% acquisition target, In progress. He took a sip of cold tea, didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply stared at the screen, like a father quietly adjusting the wheel, guiding his child back onto the right path. Day 1. Second-tier shareholders began selling. Shares changed hands rapidly. The market assumed it was a panic sell. But behind the scenes, the names disappeared from the registry right after each transaction. Vantage Holdings quietly acquired them all. Carl Tremont received an email from 3 longtime shareholders. "Sorry, Carl, the price they offered exceeded anything we ever hoped for. We couldn't say no." Carl slammed his phone down on the table. They're playing on greed, and it's working. Day 2. A board member was quietly removed from his position. No explanation given, only that he had sold all his shares just hours prior. Lucas asked, "Do you know who's pulling the strings?" Carl growled, "Doesn't matter who it is. I'll call the lawyers, threaten them, countersue, stall them." Eileen cut in, "This is a public company, Carl, not an aristocrats club. The law won't protect your pride." Day 3, 8:30 a.m. A formal notice from the stock exchange. Vantage Holdings has become the controlling shareholder with 64.2% of total shares. The current board chairman has been officially replaced on an interim basis. A press conference has been scheduled at the request of the acquiring party. At the Tremont estate, Carl stared at the television. Every financial network was broadcasting the story. No one knows who's behind it. A quiet takeover, no media blitz, no flashy headlines, just patience and perfectly timed cash. Carl tried to pour himself a drink, but his hands shook, the glass spilled. Behind him, Lucas stood like stone. Eileen said nothing, hands folded at her chest. For the first time in years, she felt afraid. Elsewhere, in a quiet law office, Amanda Lee, legal advisor for Vantage Holdings, closed the final folder with a satisfied smile. Phase 1, complete. She typed a short email. "The press conference is ready. Would you like Ms. Jasmine Carter to receive the honorary invitation as you requested?" On the other side of the screen, Edward Carter clicked once. Send. Night of day 3. Jasmine had just finished her shift and returned to her small rental apartment near Central Park. She opened her laptop to check work emails and noticed a strange message. The subject line read, "Invitation Press Conference. Announcement of new ownership at Tremont Tech for Jasmine Carter. Sender, Amanda Lee, Vantage Holdings." She frowned, hovering the mouse over the open button, a wave of uncertainty rising in her chest. She had never been in contact with anyone at Vantage Holdings. Why invite her, a complete outsider, someone no longer tied to Lucas or his company? She read the opening line. "At the direct request of the new owner of Tremont Tech, we cordially invite you to attend the official press conference announcing the transfer of executive control at 10 a.m. this Saturday at the Belgrave Grand Hotel." At the bottom, a final note. "We believe your presence is necessary." Jasmine sat still, her hand tightening around the mouse. A flood of thoughts rushed through her mind. Lucas. No, he has no reason left to see me. Is this some retaliation from the Tremonts? Or is my father somehow involved without knowing it? She picked up her phone, hesitating as she considered calling Edward. But then she lowered her hand. It was late. She shouldn't disturb him. More than anyone, he was the last person she ever wanted to drag into this. The next morning, Jasmine stopped by her father's house with breakfast. Edward was fixing an old flashlight in the corner of the kitchen. When he saw her, he smiled gently. "You've been visiting a lot lately, kiddo?" "I had some free time," Jasmine replied quietly. She almost asked him about Vantage Holdings. Almost. But then said nothing. Because deep inside, something was stirring. A vague, uneasy feeling, like an old door trembling in its hinges, about to swing open. Belgrave Grand Hotel, Emerald Ballroom, Saturday morning. Hundreds of journalists, shareholders, and media professionals packed the hall as if awaiting the IPO announcement of a tech giant. But no, today's press conference had only one headline: announcement of the new owner of Tremont Tech. Carl and Eileen Tremont sat in the front row, arms tightly crossed. Carl's eyes locked on the stage, as if trying to read the name behind the velvet curtain before it was revealed. Lucas sat beside them, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. Gone was the confident CEO once featured on magazine covers. All that remained was a man watching the empire he built about to be handed over. Jasmine was there too. She chose a seat in the third row, far right side of the hall. No one noticed her, but her eyes never left the stage. 9:58 a.m. The MC stepped onto the podium, a sharply dressed young man in a black suit, his smile polished, but his eyes cold as a blade. He opened calmly. "Thank you all for attending this press conference announcing the new executive leadership of Tremont Tech. But before I introduce the incoming owner, allow me to ask a simple question." He paused. The spotlight swept gently across the sea of waiting faces. Could a man who once drove a city bus, with no MBA, no Ivy League education, no NASDAQ bell to his name, ever become the owner of a leading technology company? 2 seconds of stunned silence. Then murmurs rose. An elderly shareholder chuckled, "Is this some kind of PR stunt?" Another muttered, "Probably a cheap branding gimmick." Carl Tremont smirked with disdain. Eileen whispered, "Just as I thought. Another man who thinks money buys everything." Lucas didn't laugh. He simply glanced toward Jasmine, who sat motionless, hands clenched tightly in her lap. The MC raised a hand. The room quieted again. Then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man's name is not on the Forbes list. He doesn't move in Silicon Valley circles, but he possesses something many in this room do not: faith, patience, and a reason that none of you could have imagined for being here today. Please welcome the new owner of Tremont Tech, Mr. Edward Carter." The entire ballroom fell into stunned silence. Carl turned to Eileen. "Edward, who?" Lucas sat frozen, the color draining from his face. Jasmine held her breath. Her heart seemed to stop. Then, the lights shifted toward the entrance. A middle-aged man in a worn grey suit began walking in. No security, no entourage. Only him, Edward Carter, the stepfather once dismissed as a family acquaintance. Now walking straight toward the stage, beneath the astonished stares of a room full of people who had once looked down on him. The soft sound of worn leather shoes echoed against the marble floor. He walked slowly past the rows of spectators, each step steady, like a seasoned driver navigating a slick winter road. No one spoke. No one dared, because everyone was silently trying to remember. Had they seen him somewhere before? Carl Tremont froze. His eyes scanned the faded grey suit, the scuffed shoes, the working man's posture. And suddenly, he remembered, that's her stepfather, the bus driver. Carl turned to Eileen, face stiff with disbelief. What is happening right now?" Eileen didn't answer. She sat still, her back rigid, her eyes locked on Edward. As if she were staring at a ghost she'd spent her whole life believing was invisible. Lucas couldn't speak either. He had once handled millions, been hailed a young genius. But now all he felt was small, ashamed, powerless. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. It was fixed on that man, her father, the one she once failed to introduce, the one she left behind in the rain, the one she hid from glittering rooms filled with chandeliers. And now, he was standing on stage, no introduction needed, no permission required. Edward stepped up to the podium, no cue cards, no teleprompter. He simply looked into the crowd holding their breath, then turned his eyes to Jasmine, a look warm and gentle, like a silent message. "You came." He drew a deep breath. His hand rested lightly on the wooden podium, steady, unrushed. Edward stood still for a few seconds. The entire room seemed to hold its breath with each beat of the audience's hearts. A soft light fell over his salt and pepper hair, his broad shoulders, and the calm face of a man who had lived quietly all his life. And then he began, "My name is Edward Carter. I'm not a PhD, not a founder, never studied at Harvard. I'm just a bus driver." Murmurs rippled through the hall. For 35 years, I've driven thousands of people to where they needed to go. And while I waited for them to finish their shifts, I read, I studied, I observed. I spent every evening attending free community investment classes, learning to read financial reports, learning how to make money work. Edward paused for a moment, then looked directly at Carl Tremont. I started with 5 shares, bought with the money I saved from night shifts. I didn't raise capital. I didn't borrow from banks. I used the only thing I trusted, hard work and time. 18 years later, I sold that portfolio at 70 times return. And I knew, if a bus driver could change his own life through discipline and belief, then he could change the fate of a company too. The entire hall fell still. A few shareholders sat upright. No more chuckles, only total focus. Edward continued, I once raised a child, not my own. Her mother passed away early. I didn't raise her out of duty, but because I saw something in her eyes, something I'd lost in myself, faith. I couldn't afford private school for her. All I had were 2 things, these calloused hands and a promise to myself she will never have to bow her head because of her father's past. Edward turned toward Jasmine, his voice softened, slowed. But one night, at a gala, when someone asked who I was, she said, a family acquaintance. The room was packed, yet now as silent as an ancient temple. Jasmine bowed her head, eyes shimmering red with tears. Edward smiled, not with blame, not with anger. I wasn't angry, I just understood. Sometimes people hide the most beautiful things in their lives simply because they're afraid of how others might look at them. Then he lifted his head. His voice grew firm. I didn't buy Tremont Tech for revenge. I don't need to stand above anyone. I don't need to teach anyone a lesson. I just want my daughter to know that the man once introduced as a family acquaintance is standing here. Not to be called father, but to prove that he was worthy with his own hands. No loans, no handouts, no begging. Edward took one step back, concluding, I may not be a perfect investor, but I know how to keep my word. I know how to keep people, and I know how to keep my dignity, even when no one sees it. He gave a slight bow and stepped down from the podium. No one applauded, not because they didn't respect him, but because every hand was busy holding on to the pride he had just awakened in them. The room remained silent after the speech. No one quite knew how to react, because in that moment, embarrassment and reverence collided like a slow-moving shockwave. Jasmine rose from her seat. She stepped slowly toward the stage, under the gaze of hundreds who had once judged her by appearance alone. But more than that, she walked toward the gentle eyes of the man she had once called a family acquaintance. She stopped in front of him. Edward said nothing. He simply looked at his daughter, the same way he always had, quietly, patiently, waiting. Jasmine knelt. The room gasped. Cameras flashed wildly. But she didn't care. Dad, her voice cracked. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the times I didn't dare call you Dad, for the times I feared how others would look at me, and forgot the one person who was always behind me. Her voice trembled, each word like a blade through her own heart. That night, I called you a family acquaintance. But the truth is, no one is more familiar to me than you. No one took me to school every morning. No one waited outside the hospital the night I had a fever. No one paid my tuition with an entire life behind the wheel. Tears streamed down Jasmine's face, falling onto the wooden stage. The hall held its breath. Edward bent down. He didn't say, I forgive you. He didn't need to. He simply helped his daughter to her feet, pulled her into his arms and whispered, I never needed a title. I just needed to see you live your truth and come back when you were ready. In that moment, the entire room broke, not from pity, but because, for the first time in their lives, they had witnessed a father quietly conquer an entire system of prejudice. With nothing but unconditional love, Lucas stood frozen below, his eyes glassy. Carl bowed his head. Eileen gripped her hands together, and for once had no words left to defend the illusion of status. Just after Jasmine embraced her father, the MC returned to the stage, voice calm and composed. We are pleased to announce, as of today, Mr. Edward Carter will officially assume full executive control of Tremont Tech. The former leadership board will be dissolved and restructured within 30 days under new directives. Carl Tremont shot up from his seat. Wait just a minute, you can't. I've been an investor since day one. The MC didn't look at him. He simply continued reading the prepared statement. Mr. Carl Tremont no longer holds voting shares. Any objections may be directed to the legal representatives of Vantage Holdings. Carl's face went pale. Eileen placed her hand gently over his, giving a small shake of her head. She understood. The game was over. Lucas rose to his feet. He said nothing. He only looked at Jasmine, the girl who once meant everything, and the only one he hadn't had the courage to protect. Jasmine met his gaze. No anger, no blame. Just the quiet truth that between them now, there was no common language left. The three of them exited the ballroom, under the gaze of hundreds, indifferent, cold, and silently satisfied. No one escorted them. No one called them back. They, who had once built their fortress of power and prestige, now walked straight into the walls they had built and met them head first, in silence. Back on stage, Edward gently held Jasmine's hand. She looked up at him and softly asked, "Are you happy, Dad?" He shook his head and smiled. "I don't need to be happy. I just need to know that you never have to bow your head because of me again." 1 week after the press conference, the name Tremont Tech was officially removed from the company headquarters. In its place, 3 simple words appeared, carrying more than just a rebrand: Carter Dynamics. Inside the 32nd floor CEO office, Jasmine sat by the window, watching as people gathered below to take photos with the new signage. In her hands was a long list of names: new department heads, strategic advisors, core investors. Most of them didn't come from elite corporations. They came from very different places. A young boy Edward once drove to school, now head of legal. An immigrant student Edward once helped find work, now risk analyst. A single mother who used to ride the 8 a.m. route every day, now director of human resources. The door opened. Edward stepped in, holding a small, worn wooden box. He set it gently on the desk in front of his daughter. Inside was an old bus key, weathered by time. This wheel once took you to school, to exams, to meet your friends. And now, it's time for you to take the real wheel. Jasmine swallowed back tears. You didn't just take over a company, Dad. You rebuilt it, with people who were never invited into boardrooms. Edward smiled. I didn't buy Tremont Tech alone. The people I used to pick up every day, they've come back, not to repay a favor, but because they believe a man who keeps his word knows how to keep people. Jasmine rose and took the key into her hand. I'll never run from the name Carter again. Good, Edward replied, because from now on, it's no longer just a name. It's a promise of how to lead a company with kindness and resilience. Outside in the company courtyard, a small ceremony was taking place. No red ribbons, no champagne. Only one thing was unveiled: Carter Dynamics, driven by dignity. He was never featured in the headlines. There's no portrait of him hanging in the company hall, but he taught his daughter and all of us that patience, dignity, and quiet love can still overcome a world full of judgment. Have you ever known a father like Edward Carter in your life? Someone who always stood behind you, asked for nothing, but was there every time you needed him? Let us know in the comments what part of this story touched you the most. And if you believe that family isn't defined by blood, but by sacrifice, please like, share this video and subscribe to Black Rise, so we can continue telling the stories that were never heard before. Thank you for staying until the end of the journey. We'll see you again on the next ride.